I know we've come a long way. We're changing day to day. But tell me, where do the children play?
The most beautiful sight that we see is a child at labor. As early as you may get labor, the beautiful, that more useful this is likely to be. Child labor.
A revolution whose time had come. The Industrial Revolution abused the child labor force. A revolution occurred as attitudes changed. The public reacted and reform was made with the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Though today we look at child labor in a negative way, in colonial times it was expected, promoted, and considered a blessing. To them it made money and kept the children out of trouble. In one Virginian law, it directly stated that child labor should be promoted to avoid sloth and idleness, wherein young children are easily corrupted.
In 1790, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, the first textile mill was built in Blackstone Valley of Massachusetts. By the height of the revolution, there were 1,100 factories on this one river. But these factories needed workers, and the most obvious solution was children. They were cheap, numerous, and had nimble fingers. At the time, there wasn't mandatory schooling, so there was little reason not to work.
From the parents' point of view, the children were helping to feed the family. With so much cheap labor, America was soon able to produce 1/3 of all the world's production. Hiring children lowered adults' wages tremendously, because why hire someone who wants to be paid more than someone who is willing to work for less?
Children were soon working with dangerous machinery and in coal mines. This caused children to lose even their lives.
The conditions that they labored under.
12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, for wages that were incredibly meager. Dangerous conditions. In the textile mills in the South, for example, that employed families, entire families usually. Children often lost a finger.
According to the United States Bureau of Statistics, in 1908, the death rate from tuberculosis among child laborers in cotton mills was double of that of other boys not employed in the mills, and girls was more than doubled. During World War I in munitions factories, it was found that child laborers were more susceptible to poisonings from the explosives. Almost 80% of the poisoning fatalities were from child laborers.
The children also worked long hours. In one state, 1/2 the boys in canning factories worked at least 14 hours a day, and many worked from 60 to 90 hours a week. This left little time for school, making them fall behind and in most cases drop out. Early child labor also created an unskilled labor force whose earnings never rose sufficient to support a family when they became adult workers. From a society where child labor was promoted and accepted, a revolution occurred as attitudes changed. With the children being treated so harshly and the adults' wages going down, there were many people and organizations that became involved. One group that fought against child labor was the National Child Labor Committee.
In 1836, the first child labor law was passed in Massachusetts, and soon other states started passing laws against employing children. To understand the effect of these laws, let's take a look at New York State. According to the New York Times, in 1880, there were 100,000 children working in New York City alone. In 1884 and 1885, New York State tried to pass laws to make it illegal for children under 12 to work in factories and to not work over 60 hours a week. However, this legislation was considered too limiting and the laws failed to pass.
Finally, in 1886, New York passed laws limiting child labor. However, there was little enforcement. With almost 43,000 factories in the state of New York, there were only 2 inspectors. In 1889, a total of 3 factories had been fined an average of $20. The southern states, relying on child labor for their textile mills, had several states with no laws against child labor.
During this time, the public was becoming more aware of the plight of child labor. From 1908 to 1916, Congress hired Lewis Hine to go throughout the United States, taking pictures of the terrible working conditions that the children had to go through every day. His pictures were very influential because it showed that the problems of child labor were real and that it should be stopped. His pictures were used by the National Child Labor Committee to make posters that influenced people across the United States. This lack of state support and enforcement resulted in several federal attempts at federal legislation. The revolution had started as the public's attitude changed. Society reacted to this revolution both for and against child labor through federal legislation, Supreme Court rulings, and constitutional amendments. Between 1906 and 1916, there were several federal bills that were attempted to stop child labor. The two that had the most effect was the 1906 Beveridge Child Labor Act and the 1916 Keating-Owing Act. Both acts used the federal government to ban goods produced by child labor from interstate commerce. When they presented the Beveridge bill to President Roosevelt, he was sympathetic to their cause. However, he deemed the bill unconstitutional. Roosevelt did grant funding, however, for a comprehensive study, and Congress also approved the creation of the U.S. Children's Bureau. The Keating-Owing Act actually became law. However, there was heated support both for and against these bills.
The conscience of the nation is aroused over the slaughter of the innocents and the blighting of the lives of tens of thousands of children who have fallen victims to the greed of gain. The children are hurried from the cradle into the factories with no childhood, no sweet memories of playtime or of home, nothing for them but toil from morning until night. In this free land, they are toiling under the glorious flag of liberty to satisfy the greed of commercialism.
My father put me to work at a cotton mill when I was 11 years of age, because he found that to be the easiest way we could make a living for a large family. And the older I got, the more I got the high regard for his judgment. It would bring hardship on a large number of people. We have state laws in South Carolina that give us all the protection we need.
The Executive Committee of Southern Cotton Manufacturers, an organization designed to defeat federal child labor laws, was committed to challenge the constitutionality of the Keating-Owing Child Labor Act. 1 month before the law came into effect, the cotton manufacturers hired Roland Dagenhart, a man who worked at a factory with his young sons, to send a complaint to Congress that the law was violating his rights. In Hammer v. Dagenhart, the Supreme Court ruled the Keating-Owing Act was unconstitutional, as the federal government did not have the right to regulate interstate commerce. In 1922 and again in 1937, Congress decided that since they couldn't get laws passed because they were unconstitutional, they would change the Constitution. But this failed to work because the southern states failed to ratify it. By 1932, every state had laws against employing children, but enforcement was still uneven.
Whereas there had been prior attempts at change, reform occurred in 1938 when Congress created the Fair Labor Standards Act. This act restricts the hours and types of hazardous work youth under the age of 16 can perform. It was deemed constitutional and had no trouble becoming a law. However, by the time the federal government was finally getting support to enact legislation, child labor was not as big of an issue. In 1933, during the Great Depression, President Roosevelt created the National Recovery Act, made up of the NRA codes as part of his New Deal. The codes were designed to help the economy
Historically,
by
without
prohibiting
mandatory
children under the
education,
age of 16
a large number of
from
children were
working,
available for
therefore
employment.
providing employment
However, by
opportunities for
1918,
unemployed adults.
all states required
Adult
children to
workers
attend
replaced
school,
child laborers.
leaving little or no
The
time to
NRA
work.
code period was the
Over the
first
next
time
child
28
labor
years,
is a problem in
school
developing
enrollment
countries
exploded
and
with an
periodically
average of
a
one
problem
school
in the
being built
United
every
States.
day.
The U.S. Department of Labor fined 3 farms in southwest Washington for using child labor. One of the children was just 6 years old.
Child labor is still being debated today by presidential candidates.
It is tragic what we do in the poorest neighborhoods in trapping children in, first of all, in child laws, which are truly stupid.
There was the Industrial Revolution that abused the child labor force. The revolution caused by the Child Labor Committee that changed previous attitudes. the reaction of attempting to stop child labor, and finally the reform that ended child labor with the Fair Labor Standards Act. There have been many reasons that changed America from a society where child labor was expected to a society where it was looked on with scornful eyes and considered barbaric. But even today, there is still room for improvement. There was the Industrial Revolution that abused the child labor force. The revolution caused by the Child Labor Committee that changed previous attitudes. The reaction of a day is to stop child labor, and finally the reform that